generating new life.
What if the sound that defined the future was born in a country running out of hope? Before EDM filled festivals, before The Weeknd, Daft Punk, or Billie Eilish turned electronics into pop gold, there was Synth Britannia, a movement born not in luxury studios, but in crumbling cities, dim bedrooms, and flickering neon. They didn't just make songs, they built an escape hatch out of unemployment, out of post-punk despair, out of a Britain that felt broken. But here's the part we never talk about. These machines, these cold, mechanical boxes became instruments of emotion, and for a generation, they rewired what it meant to be human. What drove a handful of outsiders to trade guitars for circuits? Was it rebellion or resignation, genius or accident? The rise of synth-pop wasn't just about technology, it was a cultural explosion born from industrial collapse, punk anger, and a strange faith in the future, a sound that promised escape but demanded a price. Because behind every shimmering hit, Don't You Want Me Cars, Blue Monday, there's a darker story, rivalries, burnouts, betrayal, and the slow fall from the charts when the world moved on. So how did a generation of working-class dreamers turn electricity into art and in the process change pop forever? This is the untold story of Synth Britannia, how Britain's bleakest decade built the sound of tomorrow. In 1977, Britain was cold, gray, and loud in all the wrong ways. On the radio, disco glittered, punk spat its last breath, and the charts were packed with novelty hits that burned fast and meant little. But underneath all that noise, something else was humming, low, electric, mechanical, waiting to be switched on. Quick reality check. Meanwhile, across town, factories were closing, whole cities were being shut down. In Sheffield, Manchester, London, the places that once built Britain, unemployment was crushing the young, especially those who refused to accept the future laid out for them. The promise of the post-war dream had rusted. Kids who'd grown up watching their parents work machines all day started wondering, what if the machines could sing? Hold that sound in your head, now add influence. A few years earlier, moviegoers had sat in dark cinemas watching A Clockwork Orange, its brutal images underscored by a strange, futuristic soundtrack by Wendy Carlos. For the first time, many people heard classical music played entirely on synthesizers, cold yet beautiful, human but not. It wasn't rock and it wasn't punk. It was something new, something that made the world feel like it could glitch. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. Before the synth was cool, it was complicated. Early models like the Moog or the ARP 2600 were massive, expensive, and mostly used by academics or studio engineers. The idea that working-class kids in Sheffield or Basildon could own one was almost laughable, but technology, as always, shrank. By the late 70s, companies like Korg, Roland, and Yamaha began releasing smaller, cheaper machines, gear that a young musician could actually buy on credit or secondhand. Suddenly, the future fit on a kitchen table. Quick reality check. While the mainstream was busy chasing guitar riffs and disco beats, a new kind of outsider was learning to program sound instead of strum it. These were kids who grew up surrounded by the hum of machines, the thrum of factory lines, the static of televisions left on overnight, the buzz of fluorescent lights in council flats. For them, electronic sound wasn't alien, it was home. Gary Numan was one of them, a quiet London kid obsessed with sci-fi, isolation, and the feeling that he didn't quite belong anywhere. In Sheffield, a group called the Human League were cobbling together gear using reel-to-reel tape decks and wiring mistakes into rhythms. Orchestral maneuvers in the dark were doing the same on Merseyside, merging melody and circuitry in a way that felt both nostalgic and strange. None of them looked like pop stars, none of them were supposed to be. Hold that sound again. Now add influence. The punk explosion of '76 had left behind a blueprint. Do it yourself. You didn't need a record deal or a conservatory degree. You just needed the nerve to plug in. So when synthesizers dropped in price, these kids saw their chance. The DIY ethos met new technology, and something radical happened. Working-class Britain built its own kind of futurism. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. These early synth artists weren't escaping their environment. They were translating it. The coldness of their sound wasn't about pretending to be robots. It was about survival. In a world that felt mechanical and uncertain, they mirrored it back, and people felt it. Quick reality check. Across town, major labels were skeptical. Synthesizers were still considered toys, not instruments. Rock purists sneered that pressing buttons wasn't music, but the kids didn't care. They started pressing anyway, and from bedrooms and basements came these strange, icy melodies that somehow felt warmer than anything on the radio. By the end of the decade, Britain was changing economically, politically, musically. The guitar wasn't dead yet, but it was losing ground. Something sleek, synthetic, and unstoppable was taking its place. The ingredients were all there: the post-punk attitude, affordable machines, and a restless generation with nothing to lose and everything to create. And then, almost overnight, those hums and bleeps started leaking onto the airwaves. The future had a sound, and it was British. But before it became a global phenomenon, before synth-pop conquered the charts, there was one moment, one performance that flipped the switch for good. That's where we're heading next. In the late 1970s, Britain felt like a machine running out of power. Factories were closing, unemployment lines were growing, and music, once an escape, was starting to sound stale. But deep in that gloom, a few people were quietly turning knobs, twisting dials, and breaking every rule the old music world swore by. It didn't begin with fame, it began with noise. Daniel Miller was one of those restless dreamers, a film student obsessed with sound. He bought a Korg 700S synthesizer and started experimenting in his flat. One night, he recorded a track that was more pulse than melody, cold, hypnotic, unsettling. He called it Warm Leatherette. It sounded nothing like what was on the radio. No guitars, no drums, just voltage and tension. Miller pressed a few hundred copies himself under the name The Normal and slipped them to DJs and friends. Within weeks, pirate radio started playing it. After that, the room tilted, freeze the frame. Listen to that sound one more time. Just two notes, mechanical and relentless. But beneath the repetition, you could hear something human struggling to get out. It was the sound of a country short-circuiting. Meanwhile, in Sheffield, a pair of art students, Stephen Malinder and Richard H. Kirk, were building their own laboratory of sound. They called it Cabaret Voltaire, after a Dadaist club from the early 1900s, because like those artists, they believed destruction could be creative. Using broken tape machines and early synths, they made music that didn't follow rhythm or melody. It followed instinct. Their tracks hissed, clicked, and growled. They sounded like the factories outside their windows, like machines dreaming. Quick reality check. Across town, most of Britain still didn't know this movement existed. There were no synth pop stars yet, no chart hits. These were small, dark rooms filled with DIY gear and people who looked more like engineers than rock idols, but that's exactly what made it dangerous. The sound wasn't designed for radio, it was designed for confrontation. Then came Throbbing Gristle, the most extreme of them all. They took industrial noise, political samples, and disturbing visuals and turned it into art that made audiences either leave or stare in silence. Their performances felt like rituals, not concerts. They didn't want applause, they wanted reaction. And they got it. Critics didn't know what to call it, so they labeled it industrial music. The name stuck. Hold that idea, because here's the piece almost everyone misses. These early synth pioneers weren't trying to predict the future, they were reacting to their present. Britain was industrial, cold, and mechanical. So was their sound. They weren't escaping reality. They were amplifying it. Their inspirations came from sci-fi novels, dystopian films, and the writings of J.G. Ballard, who described concrete landscapes and emotional numbness with frightening precision. To these musicians, the future wasn't a dream. It was a warning. Numbers don't tell it. This clip does. When Cabaret Voltaire played local clubs, the crowd didn't dance. They stood there frozen, not sure if they were witnessing art or madness. But something in that chaos spoke to a new generation. It said, you don't need to sound beautiful, you just need to sound honest. By 1978, word was spreading. The Normal's Warm Leatherette became a cult hit. Cabaret Voltaire's early cassettes circulated through art schools and underground record shops. Throbbing Gristle shows were banned in some venues, but every time someone tried to shut it down, more people showed up, and then the backlash landed. Mainstream journalists dismissed it as robot music. Rock critics called it soulless, mechanical, even dangerous. One magazine wrote, "If this is the future of music, God help us all." But the kids disagreed. They saw rebellion in those machines. Guitars were the language of their parents' revolution. Synthesizers were theirs. Freeze the frame again. This is the turning point. Because what began as a handful of experimental acts playing for dozens would soon ignite into a national phenomenon. Labels would start sniffing around. Radio DJs would take chances, and the underground hum of electricity was about to become the sound of Britain itself. They didn't know it yet, but the first wave of synth pioneers had just plugged in the future. And in a small TV studio in 1979, one man in eyeliner and a synthesizer would make that future explode in front of millions. That's where we're heading next. In 1979, British television flickered to life with something no one expected. A pale figure stood alone, under white light, motionless, surrounded by machines that looked more like factory consoles than instruments. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't pretending to be your friend, and then came that sound, a sharp, alien, mechanical, pulsing out of the speakers like a heartbeat made of steel. That was Gary Numan performing Our Friends Electric on top of the pops. Freeze that frame, because this is the moment everything changed. Until then, the synthesizer was still seen as an accessory, a texture behind real instruments. But when Numan stared down that camera, every kid watching understood something new. This was the band. The machine was the star. The song shot to #1, and just like that, the future had arrived. The old rock world was humiliated. Guitars were out. Circuits were in. Quick reality check. Not everyone was celebrating. Critics called it cold, robotic, even creepy. Parents complained that it sounded emotionless. But to the kids, that was the point. After years of listening to the same guitar poses and macho frontmen, they finally saw someone who looked awkward, strange, and completely unbothered by fitting in. Numan wasn't just selling music, he was selling permission. The eyeliner, the alien persona, the idea that detachment could be power. That was his rebellion. You didn't have to pretend to be a rock god anymore. You could be weird. You could be quiet. You could let the machine speak for you. Hold that sound in your head. The opening riff of Our Friends Electric is one long synth drone repeating like a question that never gets answered. Underneath, the bass line isn't played by a human at all. It's programmed. Solo it in your mind. Hear how it moves slightly ahead of the beat, like a machine trying to imitate a heartbeat. That tiny push-pull between human timing and mechanical precision is what gives the song its tension. Here's one studio trick you can't unhear after this. Numan and producer Jess Sutcliffe layered 3 different synthesizers to create that haunting lead tone. One slightly detuned, one filtered, one dry. Together they built a sound that felt alive, even though no breath was ever involved. That's why copycats never quite got it right. They used the same notes but missed the ghost in the machine. Quick reality check. Across the country, the spark caught fire. The Human League were turning their art school experiments into full songs, merging the sharp edges of electronics with pop melody. Orchestral maneuvers in the dark were doing the same, writing hooks you could dance to but also cry to. Ultravox added drama and style, blending icy synths with cinematic storytelling. Freeze that frame, look at the image shift. Gone were the leather jackets and guitars. Now it was sharp suits, neon lights, geometric stage sets. The visual aesthetic was as precise as the sound. Futuristic, minimal, intentional. The look itself became a language. Magazines and fanzines exploded with photos of pale faces and chrome backdrops. Kids started dressing like their heroes. Trench coats, eyeliner, androgyny, the kind of style that made older generations whisper and younger ones pay attention. And then the backlash landed. The press called it plastic pop. They said the musicians weren't playing real instruments, that synthesizers were cheating. But these artists knew something their critics didn't. The future of sound had always depended on machines. From the electric guitar to the studio console, technology was the instrument. They just stripped away the illusion. Solo the drums for a second. Listen to what's missing. There's no live kit. Instead, it's a rolling drum machine spitting out perfectly timed hits. That precision gave the music its robotic feel, but it also made it hypnotic, even emotional in its repetition. The more mechanical it got, the more human it felt. That paradox was the secret sauce. Meanwhile, the scene was spreading. Nightclubs like the Blitz in London became breeding grounds for the new sound. Dim rooms filled with fashion students, DJs spinning 12-inch synth records, and kids dancing like mannequins. Culture shifted overnight. Radio formats changed. Dance floors evolved. Even slang turned futuristic. Electro, techno-pop, new romantic. But here's the piece almost everyone misses. Beneath the eyeliner and electronics, these musicians were master craftsmen. They built pop with the discipline of engineers. Every sound had a purpose. Every silence was deliberate. Listen closely to the Human League's Don't You Want Me? The hi-hat ticks like a metronome. The bass stays on one note for almost half the song, and yet the tension never drops. That's not luck, that's design. The simplicity keeps you locked in, hypnotized, waiting for the next change that barely comes. That's why the song still works today. It's minimalism with emotion. One more studio trick you can't unhear. OMD often used real tape loops and field recordings, factory sounds, train noises, even the hum of fluorescent lights, and blended them into rhythm tracks. They turned the sound of Britain's industrial decay into pop art. By 1981, the myth had turned mainstream. Synth-pop acts dominated the charts, music videos pushed the imagery further, and MTV made the movement global. What started in dim basements was now the soundtrack of a new decade, slick, modern, and unapologetically synthetic. But success came with a cost. The more polished the sound got, the more divided the scene became. Purists accused the new stars of selling out. Innovators started to fracture. The machine that had brought them fame was beginning to eat itself. And yet, even as the critics circled, one thing was clear. Britain had exported the future. The machines had won. But fame is a double-edged sword. What happens when your rebellion becomes the mainstream and the very sound of escape becomes the soundtrack of every commercial and club night? That's where we're heading next.
This video is sponsored by the Lore Store on Amazon, your one-stop shop for music lovers across reggae, rock, pop, and hip-hop. We built it for real listeners who don't want to dig through 1,000 listings to find the right gear. Inside the Lore Store, you'll find 5 aisles. VIP, top, battle-tested essentials, headphones, turntables, speakers, gig-safe earplugs, smart speakers. Reggae Vibe, roots and lovers. Rock made easy. Automatic decks, warm bookshelf speakers, vinyl care. Rock lore, classic rock must-haves. Open back cans, simple amps, living room concert vibes. Pop lore, feel-good everyday setups, clean, clear speakers, easy streaming, nostalgia-friendly picks. Hip-hop must-haves, punchy bass without the muddle, closed-back headphones and living room systems that handle low end, plus a rotating crate of old album vinyl if you're rebuilding a 60s-90s collection. Every product page tells you who it's for, 3 pros, 1 con, and why we picked it. So you can choose with confidence. Flying soon? Check. VIP for noise canceling that tames plane roar. Mostly listening at home? Try open-back headphones that let live albums breathe. Want instant gratification vinyl? Our fully automatic turntable is 1 button from silence to music, and the record cleaning kit knocks down crackle so the bass tightens up. Headed to shows? Grab high-fidelity earplugs, hands-free at home. Our smart speaker picks let you say, play 70s reggae or classic pop, and you're there. Deal alert! If you use the link in the description, you'll land on our curated picks with current best available Amazon pricing and active discounts where applicable. Prices change, so buy now to lock in today's deal. Tap the link in the description, pick your aisle, grab a favorite, and tell me which category you want me to build next. The Lore Store. Listen better, with gear that gets out of the way and lets the music live.
By 1983, the Machines had conquered Britain, and now they were running the world. What started in bedroom studios and dim clubs had become a full-blown pop empire. Depeche Mode, Yazoo, Ultravox, the Pet Shop Boys, their names were everywhere. The sound that once terrified critics was now the pulse of radio, MTV, and dance floors across continents. But behind the glow of neon success, the gears were grinding. The schedule was brutal. Albums every year, tours that ran until exhaustion, press cycles that never stopped. The same technology that made creation faster also made burnout quicker. Because when you build your identity on perfection, when your sound depends on precision, every tiny mistake starts to feel like failure. We're going to sit with this for a second. For many of these artists, fame didn't feel like freedom. It felt like surveillance. Every interview, every show, every remix had to keep up with the myth they'd created. Depeche Mode were barely out of their teens, suddenly headlining arenas and being marketed as the dark princes of electronic pop. Behind the posters was a price tag: sleep, blood, sanity. Listen to how the tempo feels heavier now. Vince Clarke, one of Depeche Mode's founding members, left after their first album. He was exhausted by the spotlight and the pressure to repeat success. He went on to form Yazoo with Alison Moyet, another Sheffield voice that carried the ache of post-industrial Britain straight into electronic pop. Their songs were heartbreak, coded into voltage. Only You, Don't Go. Beautiful, simple, fragile. But even that partnership burned fast. The machinery of pop was efficient at making hits, not at keeping humans intact. Here's the part fans don't put on t-shirts. As synth pop went global, labels began demanding more hits, faster. The underground ethic, DIY, experimentation, risk started slipping away. Budgets ballooned. Producers were brought in to polish every edge. What began as rebellion started sounding like the system it once defied. Hold that sound. Now listen to how glossy it became. The warmth of analog synths gave way to early digital ones. Drum machines got cleaner, less human. The club scene shifted toward perfection, not pulse. By 1984, the same technology that had liberated artists was now boxing them in. For some, the pressure turned inward. Depeche Mode's darker themes mirrored their inner battles: depression, addiction, creative burnout. Others simply vanished. Ultravox, once symbols of sleek futurism, began fracturing under commercial expectations. Gary Numan, the pioneer who started it all, withdrew from fame altogether, struggling to find space in an industry that had moved on from the sound he created. Quick reality check. Across Britain, the world that birthed synth-pop was changing too. Thatcher's Britain was hardening. The optimism of the early 80s was fading. The clubs were still packed, but the mood had shifted. Behind the bright lights and mirrored walls was a growing sense of detachment. The same machines that once symbolized rebellion now mirrored the alienation of success. We're going to sit with that. Behind every chart-topping single was a story of exhaustion. Behind every perfect beat, a breakdown waiting to happen. Because when you build your art on control, chaos always finds a way back in. And then the end began quietly, not with an explosion, but with a fade. Fans got older. The next generation discovered new machines, new genres, house, techno, acid. The very tools that built synth-pop now powered its replacements. Most acts fade, but synth-pop didn't fade. It detonated, leaving behind fragments that would shape the next 3 decades of music. The legend froze young instead of growing safe. Because the future they built eventually caught up to them. The dream of electronic utopia had come true, and like all revolutions, its founders were left behind in the world they invented. But even in the ruins, something else was happening. A rebirth. A new wave of artists would soon rediscover these sounds, sample them, twist them, and send them back into orbit, And that's where we're heading next.
Hey, Pop Lore family. Did you know only 1% of viewers are subscribed? If you love deep dives into pop legends, forgotten gems, and the stories behind the songs that shaped generations, hit that subscribe button right now. And don't forget to turn on LL notifications so you'll be the first to know when we premiere our next video. It's free, it helps Pop Lore grow, and it makes sure you never miss a single countdown or music story. Let's build this community together.
Before the 80s, pop was made of flesh and strings, guitars, drums, sweat, and stage lights. After Synth Britannia, the rules changed forever. The sound of the future had arrived, and it never left. Listen closely to today's charts, to the underground, to your favorite playlists. You'll still hear it. The DNA of synth-pop runs through The Weeknd's retro futurist anthems, through Charlie XCX's glitchy pop rebellion, through Billie Eilish's minimal synthetic melancholy. Even in hip-hop, even in indie, the shimmer of the synth is never far away. Spot the lineage. When you hear Daft Punk's Digital Love, that's Kraftwerk's Ghost. When you hear the 1975 Layer glossy pads over Heartbreak lyrics, that's straight from the Human League's playbook. When Lady Gaga walks on stage in cyber armor, when Kanye builds a track out of pure vocoder and pulse, that's the echo of 1981, still humming through the circuitry. One sample you've heard 1,000 times, Gary Numan's Cars. It's been chopped, flipped, quoted, and licensed across decades, from basement jacks to 9-inch nails, from Prince's synth patches to modern EDM. It's the thread that connects analog rebellion to digital perfection. But this isn't just about the music, it's about what those artists proved. They showed that you didn't need a guitar hero to make magic, you just needed ideas, a cheap synth, and the nerve to sound different. That's the real legacy of Synth Britannia. It democratized creation. It made the future something you could plug in at home. Reunions and revivals keep that pulse alive. Depeche Mode still tour stadiums. Their songs aging like prophecies. OMD and Pet Shop Boys keep reappearing on festival bills, their new work echoing the same emotional voltage as the old. Documentaries, tribute nights, retro synthwave playlists. The past keeps returning, reframed in neon. But the truth is, the machines never really went away. They just evolved. What the pioneers did with oscillators and tape, today's kids do with laptops and software. The soundscape has changed, but the intent intention to find beauty in the synthetic, to make emotion out of electricity is the same. We're going to sit with that for a moment. Think about what this movement said about Britain itself. A nation rebuilding from economic decline, turning industrial decay into art. The factories closed, but the rhythm stayed. The hum of the machines became music, and in that sound, a generation found identity. Now, in 2025, we can finally see how deep the impact runs. The synth didn't just change music, it changed how we see music. It blurred the line between human and machine, between pop and art, between rebellion and design. If you were there, you already knew. If you weren't, now you do. Your turn. What was the first synth pop track that hit you in the chest? Was it Enjoy the Silence, Don't You Want Me, Cars, or something newer that carries the same spark? Drop your pick in the comments. I'll add some of them to the pinned playlist. This is Pop Lore, where music myths come back to life. Subscribe so these stories don't get buried by the algorithm, and hit the next episode where we trace how the machines of the 80s evolved into the rave revolution of the 90s. Because the story of the synth didn't end, it just found a louder beat.